Salt wind rose off the sea as the skiff scraped the volcanic stones, and John stepped down into the teeth of Dragonstone. The air smelled of old rain and rock and the faintest tang of ash that came when mist clung to cliffs. It was a place carved by fire, the steps cutting a black seam up the headland like a scar that had never healed. Davos clambered out behind him, boots slipping for a heartbeat before finding purchase. "Stairs to heaven," he muttered, eyeing the long climb. "Or down into the stranger." John said nothing. He watched the waves break, listened to them scour the pebbles and return, and tried to quiet the restless thinking that circled behind his eyes. A gull flared, white and ragged, then settled on a spur of stone. The oarsman shoved off, and the skiff slid back into gray water. Above, the fortress sat as it had in every story. Black stone grown out of blacker earth, spires like talons and teeth, windows like the eyes of some slumbering beast. For a moment the wind lulled, and another sound took its place. A shriek that seemed to pull at the marrow. John's head lifted. A shadow crossed the sun. Something vast beat the air once, twice, and the hair prickled on his neck. Davos flinched. A whisper squeezed out of him. 7 hells. John could only watch. The dragon banked low over the cliffs and vanished, the echo of its cry ricocheting along the headland. Storm or no storm, winter or no winter, nothing else in the world sounded like that. They climbed. Unsullied stood along the approach, spears canted, faces expressionless beneath smooth helms. Dothraki watched too from the shadows of high arches, eyes quick and bright. By the time John and Davos reached the top, the climb had put a slow burn in John's legs, but the ache steadied him. A woman of copper-gold skin greeted them, her garment simple but cut with a grace that made the black stone less stark. "I am Missandei of Noth," she said, voice clear and courteous. "On behalf of Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, welcome to Dragonstone." Davos bowed. John inclined his head. "Jon Snow," he said, "King in the North." "Ser Davos Seaworth, if it please you," Davos added. Her smile was small and exact. "If it please you, his grace awaits. Lord Tyrion Lannister as well." "Tyrion," Davos murmured as they followed. John's mouth tugged at a corner. They found him on the walkway above the eastern bluff, hands folded behind him, hair blown about his face. He turned, and the old half-mocking, half-wary smile surfaced. "Jon Snow," Tyrion said. "Hay of the North." "That was never clever," Jon said. "It wasn't," Tyrion agreed cheerfully. They clasped forearms, and for a moment the old cold of the wall and the memory of a lad with a satchel of books stood between them like a third companion. "Come. If we do nothing else today, at least we will stand in a hall built to make us feel small." The throne room had been cut from the heart of the hill, pillars fused from dragonfire, the chair a spine and rib cage of stone. Light bled in through narrow slits, catching flecks in the rock so it seemed the walls were constellations. John's footfall sounded like someone else's in his own ears. She was smaller than the stories, if smaller meant human. Her hair was pale as new snow. She wore no crown that he could see, no jewels but a pin at her shoulder. A silver 3-headed dragon, yet she seemed armored even in that. When she greeted them, Missandei's voice listed the titles like steps. Rightful heir to the Iron Throne, Queen of the Undulls and the First Men, Protector of the 7 Kingdoms. Davos shifted, and John felt him tense, as if the length of the list might coalesce into chains. At last Missandei fell quiet, and the room listened to its own breathing. "I am pleased to meet you, Jon Snow," the Queen said. "Your Grace," John said. He did not look away. Tyrion's gaze flicked between them. "We had hoped for a summer day," he said into the stillness. "But Dragonstone remembers the past and prefers to brood." Daenerys's smile was brief. "I was born here," she said. "Am I brooding, Lord Tyrion?" "Only with purpose, Your Grace." She turned back to John. "I sent for you some time ago, and yet it seems I arrived of my own will," John said calmly. "We have much to talk about." "We do." She glanced to Missandei, who stepped forward. "Will you swear your fealty to me, King in the North?" The North has not been independent for 300 years. Torrhen Stark bent the knee to my ancestor, recognizing the Targaryen right to rule. You have come here to do the same. Davos's breath went in sharp. Tyrion rubbed a thumb along his wine cup but said nothing. Jon felt the old bone-deep stubbornness that his men loved and some feared, the iron bar that had kept him alive on the wall when he might have bent and broken. But the words that came were not the blunt refusal he had expected to deliver. I have come, he said, to make an offer no king has made in 300 years. Not fealty, a covenant. Her head tilted, a hawk considering the shift of a field mouse. A covenant. A union of equal crowns, Jon said. The North has paid too much blood to be brought back to heel. We do not forget what the South took from us, or what it asked us to bear. I will not bend the knee, your grace. I will clasp your hand. Tyrion's brow jumped. Davos's eyes cut to Jon with something like astonishment and something like relief, as if this was the direction Jon's thoughts had turned without telling even him. Equal crowns are a contradiction, Tyrion said after a beat. Two sovereigns with one realm is a recipe for a war fought without banners. The realm is not one, Jon said. It's never been one, not in truth. The North is a country of its own. The South is a lattice of fief and river and field. What holds them is a story and fear. Choose a different story. Choose trust. Trust is not a strategy, Daenerys said, but soft, as if she did not wish tea. Oh, admit how much the word traveled her. And your men will not follow you if you bend. So you offer me a word instead. I offer you more than words, Jon said. I offer you the North as an ally, not as a subject. We will fight the same enemies, answer the same calls to arms. We will not rise against you. We will trade. We will send our boys to learn the crafts they can't from our woods and hills. We will recognize your crown in the South, and you will recognize mine in the North. And if ever there comes a day when one of us breaks the covenant, let it be written that every house bound to them pays the price with them. He felt Davos's attention steady into approval. I offer you honor, your grace, and before honor, truth, because there is something coming that does not care what songs men sing in their halls. Her eyes searched his face. The Night King, she said. He nodded once. An army of the dead. I have seen them. You do not have to take my word. He gestured to Tyrion with a brief, almost apologetic smile. Ask your hand. Ask the men who fought at Hardhome. Ask your dragons when they taste that cold. It is not a war of thrones we must fight first. Those thrones will be ash if we lose. Are you here to frighten me? She asked. I am here to speak to the only person with enough fire to change how this ends. A quiet fell that was not quite silence. Tyrion broke it. We did not drag you here, he said, but we did invite, and we hoped for your fealty. The Queen has won the Unsullied without chains, the Dothraki without coin, the loyalty of freedmen and lords both. She intends to break the wheel that has ground houses to flour. She might see herself excused for asking your knee. I would have given my life when I had none, Jon said, the memory of a knife between his ribs like cold water. But I cannot give what is not mine. The North's freedom belongs to the North. I hold it in trust. Take what I can give you. Take me at my word. She watched him a long moment more, then stood. Words can be beautiful, she said. I have learned how little they matter in the slavers' pens and burned cities. Truth is what stands when words rot. She took a step down from the throne. You come to me asking trust and offering alliance. Earn them. How? Jon asked. Do not vanish into the night with your dragonglass and your grim stories, Daenerys said. Stay. Eat at my table. Speak at my council. Let us see one another's choices and how we make them. Her mouth curved without warmth. And if your dead walk, I will see them for myself. Tyrion had never looked more relieved. Reason. How rare. Shall we begin with the day's other trouble? One of the Queen's fleets is late returning to Dragonstone. Storm? Davos asked. An uncle, Tyrion said. Euron Greyjoy has a talent for ruining small hopes. The weight of the room shifted. War gathered, as it always did, like weather. Jon inclined his head to the queen. "I will speak at your council," he said, "and I will not bend the knee. I will consider what you have asked," Daenerys said, "and I will not burn you." "See," Tyrion murmured. "Compromise." They parted with the brittle politeness of strangers who had agreed not to become enemies yet. On the walkway, the sea threw its surge against the cliffs, white water fleeing back into darker green. Tyrion walked at Jon's side, Davos just behind, eyes tracking the unsmiling faces of Unsullied, as if making a list of names he would never learn. "You have a talent for placing the board on its corner and telling the pieces to sit still," Tyrion said. Jon squinted into the light. "Would it work? In a just world?" Tyrion smiled crookedly. "In a just world, there would be no need to ask." He sobered. "You have asked the daughter of a man who was promised everything and lost it all to accept less than she sees as her due. You have placed in one hand her dream, and in the other what might save the world. I do not know which she will take. She could have me arrested," Davos grunted. "If she'd been the other sort." "She could have been a great many things," Tyrion said. "And yet she is this, stubborn, yes, like a reef, but careful. It's not a given, mind you, that the careful choice will be the one that saves anyone." Jon thought of dragons lifting dark as storms off the cliffs and of an army like snow itself moving south under a sky that had forgotten stars. He thought of the girl who had told stories of Nymeria and the boy who had laughed at them and the way they had all bled since. His voice went low. "It has to be. That first council was a storm of maps and tempers. Grey Worm returned by Raven with news of Casterly Rock taken, and Hollow. The Lannisters had emptied the castle and moved east like a scythe. Food stores burned along the Reach. Refugees clogged roads. Euron's ships cut lines of shore from line of shore like a stitcher with an appetite. Strike King's Landing with dragonfire," Yohn Royce said, who had ridden south to watch the North's interests as Sansa's chosen eyes. "End it before it multiplies." "Burn the city?" Tyrion asked softly. "How many thousands will die before the bells stop ringing?" "As many as the Lannisters will murder if we do nothing," the knight snapped. Daenerys listened, fingers steepled, her face a blade held on the soft meat of indecision. "What would you do?" she asked Jon. He did not expect the question and made himself not blink. "I have fought battles that seemed urgent," he said. "Sometimes they were. Sometimes urgency was the lie the enemy told me to make me run where he wanted me." He stepped to the table, to the narrow sea carved in pine and painted a blue that had dulled to slate. "You can break their armies without burning their homes." He touched the road west of King's Landing. "Hit their food, hard and fast. Make every barrel of grain cost them as much blood as the worst field. If you must ride a dragon, ride it where the harvest is tur. Ned to coin. Then ride north." "We're not finished here," Daenerys said. "You cannot win if you starve your allies and feed your enemies," Jon said. "Winter's at your door too, your grace. You have a city full of mouths and ships that cannot sail when the seas freeze. The North is hungry. The Riverlands are poorer than you think. Famine is the truest striker. Feed those who will follow you, and starve those who won't." A murmur of argument and assent curled around the table. Tyrion's eyes were on Daenerys' hands. Varys' eyes were on Jon's face. Missandei's quill moved. Davos's look said plainly, "Now you're a king. Send the Dothraki to harry their wagons," Daenerys said at last. "Grey Worm's men will move north to Dragonstone by land, avoiding Euron. I will ride. You will be cut out of the sky," Tyrion said, but his objection lacked heat. He had seen the sky answer the woman. "At least take scouts." "I will take Drogon," Daenerys said, and though Jon had not heard the dragon named before, he knew the sound of certainty. "You will plan their routes," she added to Tyrion. Then to Jon, "I will do this, and when it is done, we will speak of your covenant anew." She left the room like a ship finding wind. Outside, under a sky the color of hammered pewter, she stood with the saddle leathers over her shoulder as men made ready the great black beast on the clifftop. The dragon's scales caught the thin light, each a currency of shadow. As Jon watched her mount, a noise as old as fear climbed his spine. Drogon turned his head and looked at Jon, the yellow eye a coin balancing on his breath. He did not move. "Do not," Davos hissed. Jon stepped closer. The dragon's head lowered, the nostrils flaring. He could smell damp ash, old earth, iron. A pulse jumped in his throat. Without knowing why, without thinking at all, he lifted a hand and placed it on the warm ridge between the beast's eyes. The heat soaked into his skin and bone. A sound like a furnace purring rolled through the dragon's jaw. Somewhere behind him, Tyrion said something too softly to hear. "Gentle?" Daenerys said from the saddle, not to Jon, to the dragon. But the word settled on Jon's shoulders like a hand nevertheless. He took his hand back and stepped away. Drogon's head rose. The enormous wings beat, and the world rushed with wind. They rose, a black blade knifing into cloud. For a moment Jon's heart rose with them. Then they were gone, and he was left with the cliff and the falling long lines of rain streaking over the sea. The word of the battle by the loot train came to them in fragments. Dothraki screams like laughter, knights breaking, men roasted in their armor. The ground black and smoking, the air a film of ash. Tyrion, listening, paled with every detail. Davos crossed himself without thinking. "She won," Tyrion said, and it did not sound like triumph. "Gods help us, she won." When the queen returned, smoke clung to her braids. Pride and something like sorrow lived in her eyes. She stood again before Jon, this time in the courtyard with rain waiting without starting, the air holding its breath. "They will remember," she said. "They will," Jon said. "Will they eat?" She nodded once, short. "We took the grain. We will send ships north. Not many, not while Euron stalks, but enough." She studied him, then the sky. "You looked a dragon in the eye without flinching," she said. "That is rare." "I've looked worse in the eye and flinched," Jon said. "And lived anyway." "Come," she said. "There is something you should see." They walked to the caves beneath the castle, lanterns in hand. The world above gradually compressed. The sound of the sea grew narrower and farther, the thin drips of water louder. The air was chill and tasted faintly of salt and stone. At last the passage opened into a chamber where the light of Jon's lantern climbed over walls busy with shapes. At first he thought they were the scratches of ancient restless prisoners. Then he saw that they were drawings. Men with stick limbs and round heads, horses like children made them in the dirt with a bone. Then, deeper, the shapes turned strange. Tall figures with eyes carved round and cold, sharp hands, mouths too narrow. Around them, spirals. Jon's breath misted. "The children," he said, "and the first men." "And something else?" Daenerys said, her own lantern held high, her face made colder by the light. "The enemy, you say, is coming. They drew what they feared in the old days because no one believed them, I think." She traced the spiral with her eyes. "Now you bring me the same tale, and I am a queen, and I am asked to be more than a conqueror, to be wise. You asked how to earn trust," Jon said. "Show the North this, and send us what we need, time and iron and grain. We will craft daggers enough to voice a forest, and accept the covenant." They walked back without speaking, the light making gold edges on the blackness and then surrendering to it. On the beach, the sea had dropped a skein of weed on the stones, and a cormorant stood with wings open like a priest. Daenerys lifted her face to the wind and closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she looked down, the decision had settled behind her eyes like a coin sinking to the bottom of a well. "Missandei will draw the covenant," she said. "Tyrion will review. It will be called the Pact of Dragonstone. The North will be named sovereign, ruler of itself, and bound by oath to my rule in the South. In war we will be one. In peace we will not trespass on each other. Trade will run. Roads will stay open. Counterweights will be named. If either crown betrays the other, it breaks not only its word but its right to be called just." She looked up at him with a challenge that was almost humor. "Is that your language? Or have I begun to speak like you?" "It will do," Jon said, and to his own surprise, laughter moved in him, some knot loosening at last that had not loosened even when he had been named. King by men who never expected to say the words. It will do as the beginning. They made it so. Missandei's hand was a patient river, turning words into law with curves that would have shamed a swan's neck. Tyrion argued clauses out of their first shape and into one that would hold water. Varys was the silent gravity of the room, making the ink feel heavier with his gaze. Davos, having never much cared for such things, read what he could and asked what he could not read, and Jon watched him grow in the asking. When the day came to sign, a storm paced the far horizon like a dog unwilling to come in. They met in the painted chamber, the map of Westeros beneath their feet, the table set up at the neck where marsh met hill. Missandei read the covenant aloud in her clear voice. Men who had sharpened blades their entire lives stood very still and listened to the crossing of T's and the bell of the word whereas. Daenerys signed first, her name a sweep and cut. Jon signed second, his hand careful, the J plain and stubborn. Missandei sanded the wet ink and blew. In that moment, something passed in the room like a wind with no source. If it had been a god's wood, Jon would have sworn he heard the leaves whisper. He did not call the North's lords down to witness. The ravens would carry the news faster than horses. But he wore into the hall the heavy cloak of white and gray they had draped on him on the day of his crowning. He felt their eyes on him as if they watched through it. He felt Sansa's eyes, cool and assessing, and Arya's, sharp and bright, and Bran's, elsewhere and here. After, they ate together, for the first time as allies and not as polite opponents. Fish from the morning's net, bread coarse and warm. A stew that tasted more of onion than of meat but could still fool the hunger into believing itself satisfied. Tyrion drank a little and then stopped, which told Jon more than speech. Daenerys ate slowly, considering each bite as if it were another clause she might amend. "Your men will mine the dragonglass," she said between dishes. "My men will help. We'll craft weapons here and send them north with the grain." "Eastwatch is nearest by sea," Jon said. "Tormund Giantsbane holds it with wildlings you freed." The flicker of thanks in her look was quick and unguarded. "If Euron prowls, we'll need to move by night or wait for a fog. Or we will simply light the sky and dare him to come," Daenerys said. She glanced up as the last of the light bled out of the windows. "I did not think to wager my name on such a, what did you call it? An equal crown. If I am wrong, I will have lost what I have bled for. If I am right..." She left the sentence unmade. "If you are right," Jon said, "the realm will be stronger than it has been in a long time." "And what of you?" she asked. "What do you lose or win?" He thought of the godswood at Winterfell, the red leaves black with snow, the old faces cut into wood, and how sometimes, as boys, they had played there, and sometimes, as men, they had bled there. He thought of his father who was not his father, of words about duty that had been as heavy and as warming as a cloak. "I keep faith," he said simply, "or I break it. That's all." News ran on their heels like a dog in a hurry. Euron stalked the sea, snapping at cormorants, but could not be everywhere. The first ships made for White Harbor with grain, while the next hugged the coast north to Eastwatch with crates of dragonglass and the tools to work it. In Winterfell, Sansa read A Raven from Dragonstone and paced long hours in a room whose fire never seemed to warm the stone. "He will tie us to her," Lord Glover had warned before Jon sailed. "He will make us submit again." Sansa held the covenant in her hands and saw where Jon had kept them standing. "Equal crowns," Yohn Royce said when he returned to Winterfell long enough to warm his boots and rub the soreness out of his knees. He was mad to ask it. He lifted his tankard and amended, "Mad or brave, which is often the same thing in a Stark." Sansa looked at the hearth. And Daenerys Targaryen was madder still to sign? The question tasted cautious in her mouth. "She is not her father," Royce said carefully. "And she is not Ned Stark either, gods rest him. She is something else. I do not know yet whether the realm will prefer what she is." She sent food. Sansa's hands went tighter together. "I know what the realm prefers when it is hungry." She looked across the room. "Have Maester Wolkan send men to the outlying holds. Take account of every sack, every child. No one goes to bed without something, even if it's thin. "A queen's task," Royce said with deference and a trace of humor. "A lady's task," she snapped, then softened. "Someone must do it." In the Godswood, Arya stood with snow like sifted flour catching in her hair and listened to the quiet. A new sound had returned to Winterfell, a doggish bark that wasn't a dog. "I saw her," she said to the weirwood, as if the tree could carry planes of time and distance. "She's big now." She looked at me like I was something she'd left behind and expected to find. "If the queen flies north, maybe Nymeria will come too." She smiled into the cold. "Let the dragon see what tooth looks like when it comes in a pack." Bran sat beneath another tree's bare arms and let the world turn in his head. He saw the sea like hammered lead and a black shape sliding low over it. He saw ice. He saw the Night King step onto a frozen bay without hurry, the dead behind him in their myriads, a glacier learning to walk. He saw the wall rising like an oath that had forgotten how to be kept, and he saw an army find the place where oaths ended, at the edge of the world where the water had gone stiff as iron. He reached for the vision's edge and pressed it inward, trying to push it further away or forward in time. The vision moved, but not as he wanted. He sent the raven with a word to Jon that was not really a word but a feel. ING like frost on the floor under a door. The raven stitched the air to Dragonstone and found Jon in the forge above the caves, hammering at a blade that wanted to splinter. Jon read the message and felt the cold in his bones, as if he had been standing barefoot on the stone floor. "Bran saw it," he told Daenerys. "The dead will go around the wall. The sea is freezing. They'll pour into the land by Eastwatch." "Then we go to Eastwatch," she said without hesitation. "The dragons will burn them before they can find the roads." "You can burn them," Jon said. "Then it will snow black with their ash, and the wind will drive it into our teeth. Better than the alternative." He drew a breath. "But we still need the south. If the dead come, not even dragons will hold them alone. The Lannister armies are men, and men are the fuel we must throw into this fire. Cersei Lannister will not come and fight because we send her ravens. She will call them lies. She will call you." "I know what she will call me," Daenerys said, the briefest smile. "Some of the names are not wrong." "Then show her," Jon said. "Bring a white to King's Landing." "We have played this game," Tyrion objected at once. "We send our best into a frozen night to fetch a corpse not entirely dead, and we hope the Night King sends only a handful after them? We hope we are not changing an already bad game for a worse one." "We prepare better," Jon said. "We trap a straggling party, not a horde. The dragons wait nearer. We set fires they cannot cross and barriers they cannot climb." He met Daenerys' eyes. "Or we accept the South will not come, and we face 500,000 dead with the North and what you bring. I have done the counting. It ends with the North a cold graveyard and the South waiting for the winter that follows." Tyrion looked at the Queen. Varys looked at no one. Davos swore under his breath. "All right," Daenerys said. "We will fetch the dead a leash." Jon went himself. There was no question of him sending others into the maw without him. Tormund laughed when he saw him come through the gate at Eastwatch, clapped him hard enough to rattle ribs, and grinned with a mouth like a broken picket fence. "You'll catch your death," he said cheerfully. "I've been there," Jon said dryly. "It wasn't restful." He looked past Tormund at the gray line on the horizon that was not cloud. "We need one of them, alive." The words felt like tasting rust. They set their trap on a ridge west of the castle, where the rocks narrowed the valley into a throat. Men from the Watch and wildlings both dug pits and drove stakes into the ice. The dragons were smoke-black dots against the winter sky, circling slow enough not to give themselves away. The wind crawled out of the north like a beast with a dozen legs. They got their chance when a scouting band of the dead detached itself from the larger mass and came slanting along the valley. It was smaller than they had hoped and larger than was comfortable. 20 whites and a white walker with a spear of ice blue as the heart of winter. Jon's hand closed on Longclaw's hilt. "Hold," he said, and the word went down the line like thrown bread. They lit the pits when the dead were half through the gorge, fire blooming up sudden from the oil and brush and pitch, heat beating their faces back. The whites stumbled into the pits, hands clawing, and burned. The White Walker turned and looked at the blaze with something like contempt. Jon ran straight at him. They met with a ringing sound that reminded Jon of bells in a city he had never seen. Ice and Valyrian steel kissed and skidded. The White Walker's spear shaved a hair from Jon's ear. Jon slid and cut and felt the drag of strange weight through his arms. Then the Walker overreached and Jon swept in, cut low through a knee, and brought Longclaw up hard under the collarbone. The sound the Walker made was not a human sound. He shattered, exploding into ice dust, and 9 of the Whites fell with him like puppets dropped to a floor. "Take one," Jon shouted. "Take one while it's still." They swarmed the last of the not fallen and grappled it, rope biting, iron biting. It snarled like a wolf with its throat cut and clawed its own face trying to escape the rope. One of Tormund's men took a slash that opened his cheek to the bone. They dragged the thing back into the throat between flames and tied it to a sledge, 2 men keeping their hands on the ropes and not on the thing, because the thing bit and never tired. The wind changed. The far horizon moved. A cold like a thought ran over the ground and into the roots of the rock. "Go," Jon said, not shouting now. "Go fast." They hauled the sledge and kept their heads low, and the dead took the ridge behind them like water pours over a lip. The dragons were black notches now, decreasing the distance in great lazy chevrons of wing, and Jon felt, absurdly, the thought that they would be too late chase his heels. They were not. Fire fell from the sky in a sheet that bent answers out of the trees. The front ranks of the dead blackened, curled, shouted the thing like teeth chattering all at once. The men cheered and did not stop moving. Daenerys rode Drogon so low Jon could see her hair whip, her mouth open on a word he had learned. Rhaegal swept left and scorched a flank. Viserion took the right with a narrow tongue of fire that burned cleaner, more blue. Then the storm came. A blizzard descended with the Night King at its back, and the dragons had to climb to keep their wings. Fire vanished into white, a hiss and a shout and then nothing. The world went small and bit their faces. Men slipped and fell and rose and fell and did not rise. Jon felt the cold try him like a blacksmith tries steel. Strike, quench, strike again. Daenerys dropped anyway. He did not see how she judged where the ground was. He only knew Drogon landed with a thud that shook his teeth. She shouted something at him he did not heed. He seized the sledge, flung the tied White over a horn, and swarmed up the dragon's side with hands he could not feel. Men jammed up behind him. Tormund shoved someone's arse and howled merrily. Rhaegal screamed above them, sound like tearing iron. The Night King walked out of the snow as if he were made of it. He raised a spear. Jon felt his veins freeze. Daenerys kicked Drogon into the air like a girl telling a horse to dance. The spear flew and missed by 3 men on a gallows. They climbed into cloud. Cold stole into Jon's chest and threatened to sit down and not rise. He clung to leather and scale and dared himself not to pass out. They broke through at last into a sky as clean as a sword newly drawn. The world below was a royal of gray. Rhaegal rose at their flank. Viserion burst from cloud on their other side, blue flame curling about his teeth as if he laughed. Jon felt something feral smile in him, sudden and savage, that had nothing to do with crowns or covenants. Then they were above the wall and the old thing stretched out beneath them and the world drew breath again. They landed at Eastwatch to cries and men pulling men loose. The White tried to bite whoever came near it, and Tormund cuffed it cheerfully and called it his cousin. Thuras of Myr had a new cut across his scalp and bled as if it were spring and he had taken to gardening. But he laughed and demanded wine. Beric let his sword's fire die and sat down hard in the snow and closed his one good eye. Daenerys dismounted and stood too still. Jon slid off Drogon and staggered to find his legs. She was watching the sky over the sea, where the blizzard swallowed the horizon. "He aimed for me," she said tonelessly. "He knew." "He knows your fire," Jon said hoarsely. "Keep your distance next time. You're not his to kill." Her mouth tugged. "Am I yours?" The question landed like a stone thrown into a well. "You're our only hope," Jon said roughly, sick of gentle words, of careful steps. "The North needs you." The South needs you. I need you to be alive." He squeezed his eyes shut. "We got what we came for." They did. They caged the White and hauled it south, this time in daylight because speed would outstrip secrecy and the sea was too dangerous for shadow. Euron's ships did not find them, not there, not then. The wind blew a day of grace into their sails. But there's more than we can count, and they are coming now. Choose. Jaime rode north with them after a night spent in that room of broken promises. He sat his horse like a man who had had a limb cut off and was still looking around for it in puzzled irritation. The storm that met them north of the Neck was not a single storm but a procession of them, each carrying a different grievance. The dead had done as Bran had seen. They had gone around the wall where the sea had skinned over. Eastwatch had burned and then frozen, a shell with fire still deep in its bones. They did not slow. Lyanna Mormont was already at Winterfell, standing on a box so she could berate men twice her size with the proper vantage. Glover apologized to Sansa and offered her a sword he claimed had never failed him and had been, in fact, his father's favorite backscratcher before he knew it was a sword at all. Jon arrived with Daenerys and with 3 dragons that screamed the sky clean. The first time the people of Winterfell saw the Queen's shadows cross their fields, they ran or ducked or raised hands as if arrows shot from their fingers could bring down thunder. The second time, they stared. By the third, they watched like men at a market seeing something they might one day afford. Daenerys walked Winterfell's old stones with a face that did not know how to be welcome in such places and made herself unafraid anyway. Sansa greeted her with a courtesy as thin as ice in a horse trough. Arya watched and balanced a knife on the backs of her fingers and smiled with neither malice nor kindness. Bran looked up as if he had been staring at the inside of the world and nodded solemnly to a queen who sometimes dreamed of breaking it and remaking it whole. "You don't eat enough," Sansa told Daenerys the first night, feeling the tremor in her own legs and disliking it. "The cold will take it from you without asking." "Winter has not known me," Daenerys said and smiled. It was not pride. It was a woman telling a storm it had not yet met what it would be facing. The work was dirty and constant. They lined the walls with barrels of dragonglass arrowheads. They drove pikes into the ground until their palms blistered and then scabbed and then hardened. Gendry came up from the forge 12 times a day with another cart of knives. Axes, glaives that looked like a farmer's hoe had hated its life and chosen a new one. Men learned to strike for joints and eyes. Women learned to set fires to burn when water touched them. Old men who could not hold pikes and young boys who should not held ropes and pulled, dragged, lifted, lashed. Grain came and was counted and came again as the sea allowed and as the roads stayed open. In the middle of this, Bran said to Samwell Tarly a handful of words that turned the ground under Jon's feet to something unstable and dark and strange. He and Sam told him together by firelight, in a tower where dusty summer lived in the smell of old wood. Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. 2 names. A truth like a drum in his chest. "Your name," Sam said carefully, "is Aegon. Aegon Targaryen." Jon sat still. He could hear his own breath. He could feel the presence of 2 fathers, one dead and yet living in this truth. "I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen," he said, not to be believed but to be said once so it would exist. "I am his son, and I am the son of Eddard Stark still, the man who raised me, who married me to honor, if not to love." "You are both," Sam said, not pained, not joyful, just kind. "It does not have to mean more than you let it," he told Daenerys. He told her with his hands steady and his voice iron. She listened as if he had asked her to remove her heart and look at it. She smiled a little sad. "Brave. So you have the claim," she said. "More right than mine." He shook his head. "More story. The same right, if right is a thing that can be weighed. I will not weigh it." He drew breath. "Our covenant is not a thing a father gave to me and I kept. It is a thing we made. Together. Will your people accept that you are a Targaryen?" She asked, quiet. "They will accept I am Jon," he said, and hoped it was true. "And if they do not, I will earn back what I can." "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The truth?" he asked. "It's not a choice I made. The equal crown. He smiled, a small, writhing. Not for a moment. The dead came with the patience of a glacier and the malice of a creditor. They did not attack as a storm breaks. They flowed forward like a sea tide with the moon at its throat. The first bodies piled against the stakes were men from Last Hearth who had not run fast enough. Lucerne Umber was among them, transformed into a thing that moved without a soul until a flame bared his bones, and then they were just bones, familiar and terrible. Jon stood on the wall beside Daenerys when they saw the first ranks in the distance. A smear of charcoal on snow, a moving bruise. The sky above them went old and tight. The dragons threw shadows like sails. "Remember the plan," Jon said to everyone and no one. "We do not ride out. We hold. Fire first, then glass. We save our strength for the night when they always press hardest." He looked at the ground where trenches waited with tinder soaked and covered. "We save our strength because there will be no second day if we spend it all now." Dothraki without their horses stood in lines like men learning stillness for the first time. Grey Worms unsullied understood stillness already. A discipline, a peace. Brienne led the left flank in a voice like a bell rung morning and night. Jaime stood with her, and his sword had remembered how to be a sword again and not a piece of houseware. The hounds smoked and glowered and talked to no one. Theon led a unit in the Godswood where Bran sat in his chair, making the air smell like sap and winter and something too old to call the name of. The first wave broke. Fire took them in a sheet and a roar and turned the world to brightness that hurt. The second wave came, and the third, until the trenches were a river of black flame and tea. The air a charcoal breath. The snow fell dirty and did not soften anything. Jon and Daenerys held the dragons until the dead were a mile wide, then used them like two large men might use knives. Careful, hard, decisive. Where they burned, the dead died. Where they died, the living breathed or coughed and stood again. They saved the dragons for when the fronts swelled and thinned, for when the dead sought to crawl over the trenches' black tongues, for when the living's lines bowed like a bow and threatened to snap. Rhaegal took a wound on the left shoulder, from what Jon did not see, only felt it in the way the dragon's body changed under him, the sudden drag on the air, and Daenerys swung Drogon to protect him, and Viserion arced without a rider and carved a path for both with a long line of blue-edged fire. Night deepened. Tiredness went from being something you could name to a place you lived. The Night King came at last, as Bran had said, not on a dragon because they had denied him that, but on a horse that looked carved from moonlight and bad dreams. He walked when he reached the line of living fire, and the fire gave way before him like a dog, and Jon felt something in him answer, a recognition that had no name. He dropped from Rhaegal with ice and exhaustion weighing his limbs, and the world narrowed then to a man walking through fire without being touched and a man walking toward him with a sword that had lived too long. They did not meet. The Night King turned, as if something had tugged at him from across the field, and he looked toward the Godswood. A wind went through the ranks of the dead like a rumor. Jon ran, and the world opened for him and closed behind him. He reached the edge of the Godswood in time to see a shape flicker between the trees, no more than a shadow at the corner of sight, quick as a cat. Theon's exhale was a sound like someone whose back had been carrying a load too long and had decided it could carry it a little longer. The Night King stepped into the Godswood with his eyes looking like lakes that had frozen and cracked and refrozen, hiding something black at the bottom. Bran sat and did not stand. Theon charged and met the spear. It went through him like a truth. He died with a better look on his face than he had lived most of his life wearing. The shadow flickered again. Two White Walkers came with their hands raised to catch a dart. There was no dart. There was a girl whose feet found the places with no snow and whose breath held itself. She leaped, and the Night King turned, and his hand closed around her throat. And for a heartbeat it seemed the old story would end with a new and uglier lesson. She dropped the dagger from her left hand as if tired, and did not look at it as it fell. She caught it with her right while it fell because she had done this 1,000 times in a place between breath and heartbeat, and drove it into him where men kept a heart. The dragonglass slid into ice. The winter there heard a word it had not learned and broke trying to say it. The Night King shattered into parts too sharp to name and did not make a sound. The dead behind him fell, as if pulled backward by strings. then lay still as any fresh corpse. Silence took the gods' wood, frightening and pure. The wind went on without noticing. Arya bent over her own knees and breathed like a bellows. Bran looked at a place in the air above her head and smiled very faintly. The way a boy in a story might smile when the last page has turned and he knows his mother will close the book and he will be allowed to sleep. Elsewhere, men looked up from dying and realized they were alive, and that realization humbled them more than a priest ever had. Davos sat down hard on the parapet and let the tears come because no one was looking and the Onion Knight was allowed to salt the winter. Grey Worm looked at his spear as if surprised to still hold it. Jaime's laughter was one sound, brief and raw. They burned what needed burning and laid the rest under stone. They mended the broken and drank to those who would not mend. The dragons lay in the snow like grand cats, lungs making white plumes that rose and vanished. Rhaegal's shoulder bled thick and slow and then clotted. Viserion slept with his head on his paws, the line of his jaw looking almost delicate in the half-light. Drogon let a stable boy pat his flank once and only once. Sansa walked the yard with her cloak drawn tight, counting without speaking, touching shoulders, smoothing a blanket, a lock of hair off a brow. She looked at Daenerys once across a courtyard half of snow, half of old blood. There was a nod then. It was not warm. It was not cold. Could grow. Now the other war, Tyrion said the day after the pyres cooled and before the bruises did. His nose was purple and yellow, and he held tea instead of wine and pretended not to notice he preferred it. The one we tried not to make while we made this one. If Cersei kept her word, Varys said dryly, the stranger will throw down his scythe and announce he has decided to be a cobbler. Jon looked at Daenerys. She looked back. We go south, she said. Her voice had changed. Not broken, not hardened to uselessness, but grown a second tone beneath it, like a harmony. We do not burn a city. We end a rule. The march south was slow. Men could not be asked to bleed twice in a week without being given time to learn their names again. But they went, because that is what men with swords do when told by those whose oaths they have taken. The North did not drag its feet. Too many in the North had learned what lay beyond dragging. The Riverlands joined with faces set toward a future they had doubts about. The Vale kept its nose in the air and its pikes in order. The Reach sent men who had once been Lannister men and had decided they had had enough of being told whom to hate. Cersei filled King's Landing with wildfire and lies. Qyburn's scorpions rose on the walls like thorns on an old bitter rose. Euron paced the bay like a shark that wanted to grow legs. The city's poor counted bread and then gave up on counting and counted breath instead. The bells waited, dull, disused. They laid siege like patient men who had learned the cost of impatience. Tyrion placed the trebuchets not to hit houses but to knock away teeth. Here a gatehouse, there a tower. Varys's little birds brought him news of vents, tunnels, a baker's boy with a key to a side door, a septon who had 6 reasons to live and 3 bags of coin that would help him find them. Daenerys walked the lines and taught men how not to be afraid of the shadow that crossed them when Drogon went by. Jon moved through camp with quiet words, a hand on a shoulder, a short laugh like breaking ice in a bucket. The men learned to say her name without strangling on it. The Northerners learned to say dragon without spitting. Jaime found a way in and a way up and a way to his sister's side. He stood there a long while, longer than a man with his life on the line should stand. He told her a story that did not change because it had ended the same way every time he told it to himself. With his hands around a mad king's throat, with bells ringing, with children crying. He killed Cersei not because he hated her. If that had been true, he would have done it long ago. But because he loved the city, and love means sometimes setting a torch to someone else's will. He killed her gently, which was as cruel a thing as any man ever did. He died before dawn with the blood on his hands washed by rain that did not know what it washed. The bells rang not because a dragon burned the tower from which they hang, but because a boy frightened for his mother dragged the rope hard enough to set skins to shaking. Daenerys heard them and reined Drogon to a higher circle. The city opened gates not because it had been beaten so badly it forgot pride, but because there were men on both sides who had run out of reasons to fight. There were still pockets of men with reasons. They died or were bound. There was still wildfire hidden. The Hound and Arya did their work and came back singed and singeing, and Sandor laughed with half the lungs of a man. Tyrion found his brother where they laid him out with those who had not been enemies long enough to earn hatred, and cried like a boy with a twisted knee. Varys burned the last of his little notes and sent his birds away. They stood in the throne room while the dust still fell. The Iron Throne seemed smaller than its legend, more like a chair a practical mason would shake his head at for being uncomfortable. Daenerys walked to it and did not sit. Jon stood a pace to her right. Tyrion held the Covenant in his hands like a talisman, like a stone at the bottom of a river. The air smelled of old smoke and an older vacancy. "A queen should sit," Tyrion said softly. "Queens have sat," Daenerys said. "Look where it got us." She turned to Jon. "Where does it put us?" He could hear the north in his chest, Sansa's careful voice, Bran's absence weighing the corners of things down so they did not blow away Arya's blade's balance. He could hear the south in hers, freedmen cheering her in cities whose names had become part of her name, the crack of chains, the smell of salt. He looked at the chair and then at the map under their feet, the painted table that had taught him to see. "Separate," he said, "and bound. The Covenant holds. You are queen of the 6 kingdoms. The North remains the North." He said it and waited for the world to argue. It did not. He breathed. "We make roads," he said, "that do not only carry armies. We build granaries before palaces. We appoint judges who answer to 2 thrones at once so they cannot be bribed by one. We send children over the neck to learn to read in the same room. We send bread south when the crops fail in Dorne and wine north when the wolves are lean." "You are a poor poet," Tyrion said, but his eyes were bright. "But I take your meaning." Daenerys looked at the throne and then turned from it, crossing the floor so the blades looked like a bent field of wheat behind her. "Then so it shall be," she said. "The pact of Dragonstone holds. The realm is 2 and will act as 1. They made a court in which no one bowed more deeply because of his father's grave. They made a council in which a woman who had been a slave could speak and be heard, in which a man who had sold onions counted coin and made it add up to something like plenty, in which a dwarf told jokes and watched the room laugh and also listened when he did not joke. They fed the city. They sent grain north on barges that had to pick their way past the bones of ships. They disbanded companies and formed new ones. They built kilns to melt dragonglass into panes to use in windows because someone had the cheerful thought of letting more light in. It slipped out of the forge and into the world. Weapons turned into glass that caught the sun and threw it back. At Winterfell the snows relented at last and the first green came up like hope too early and then, with a second thought, came again and stayed. Lyanna Mormont died thin from wounds and with a tongue sharp enough to cut the air and bequeathed Bear Island to a cousin who had never expected to see the sea again. Gendry went back to the smithy and found he liked making plowshares better than spears. Brienne stayed until Sansa looked at her and said, "Thank you." And then she went south and stood with hand on sword hilt in a city that finally understood what honor cost and how cheap a thing it had been sold for. Arya watched the dragons when they came sometimes, shadows across the barley, and thought briefly of sailing west from west but put it away for later and let herself learn a thing with no edges. Peace. Bran took roots in the past and the future both and learned to lift them now and then and let the present be enough. Sansa ruled, which meant both less and more than story. Promised. Jon walked the Godswood and felt the weight of 2 names sit on his shoulders and did not stoop. One day a raven took wing from the Red Keep with the small neat note that things sometimes went wrong and sometimes went right and most often went both. It flew north and found Winterfell in sunlight. Sansa broke the seal, read the script and smiled a fraction, the way one smiles for oneself when no one else needs to see. When Jon read it, a small wind shifted in the Godswood. He put the letter down beside him and looked up at the light through bare branches just leafing. "She will come north in summer," he said aloud to the leaves and to no one, "to see the roads we've made together." Davos found him there and stood, hands behind him as if he were 12 and at a loss. "Your Grace," he said, "there's a lad wants to be a squire so badly, he can't stop tripping over his own feet." "Make him a squire," Jon said. "If he keeps standing up after he trips, he'll do fine." He looked down at the letter again and traced a sentence as if it were a path he was learning to walk. "We will send them our best ale," he added, almost to himself, "and they will send us their best fools." "We have you already," Davos said carefully, and when Jon looked up, the older man's face folded into a grin, as if he had been relieved to be able to say it. Jon laughed, and the laugh sounded like the river when the ice breaks. Beyond them, the realm's many roads led away and toward Workaday, dusty, pitted, mended, used. The dragons flew them sometimes and through shadows ahead of travelers who had learned to look up and smile. The Pact of Dragonstone did not fix everything. It held harder than some imagined and softer than others wanted. It was a living thing, which is to say it changed and survived and had to be tended. It lived because men and women chose that it would, and because they had seen what comes when you choose anything else. Spring came slow, came uneven, came like a bargain kept. Men planted, and some of what they planted grew, and some did not, and they tried again. Children laughed in streets that had learned other sounds. Priests argued in corners and sometimes won, and sometimes the arguments were not worth the breath. The North remained. The South was a city and farms and roads and ports, and 1,000 small hearts beating without asking who had given them leave. Jon sat under the weirwood now and then and spoke to men the world could no longer answer. He thanked them and cursed them and forgave them and failed to, and the tree took all of it with that patient godlessness of wood. He walked the battlements with Sansa and spoke of taxes and wolves. He sparred with Arya and learned that some defeats teach better than victories. He spoke with Bran and heard histories that uncurled like scrolls and futures that would not lie still long enough to read. When summer came at last in truth, he rode south. The air grew gentler, the roads busier. He saw fields, and the fields were not armies lying down. He rode into King's Landing with a small guard and no great show, and still the people gathered to see and judge. He saw a boy he thought he had seen before, and a woman with an old scar, and a man in a hat who looked like a man in every hat and saw in them all the same thing. A kind of willingness to lean toward life rather than death as long as someone made it worth it. Daenerys met him in the courtyard, sun on her hair so that for a heartbeat it looked like the head of a match just struck. She smiled easily. It was not a thing she had been taught to do. It was a thing she had learned. "Your Grace," she said. "Your Grace," he returned. They looked at each other across a space that had once been filled with suspicion and now held something else. "Come," she said, and showed him what they had built and what they were trying to build and what had failed for now but would be tried again. He nodded and showed her what they had tried and what had failed and what would be tried again. They stood in a long room together and argued 10 words into 9. They walked on the walls and watched the sunset paint the roof's copper. That night, the court feasted with less grandeur than it once might have. The food was good, the ale not as good as Winterfell's and better than a dozen towns between. Music slid along the stone. Tyrion told a story and did a magic trick with a cup and made a child staring from a doorway gape. Missandei sat with Sansa and compared lists that no one else cared to compare. Varys moved like a wind with nowhere to be. Davos explained to 3 scribes how a ship moves through water. Gendry drank beside a man who had once called him a bastard and called him brother now and meant it. Jon went out to the terrace and looked at the stars winter had hidden. They made patterns that no book could pin down, and every heart tried to anyway. Daenerys joined him. They didn't speak for a long while. The city breathed below like a thing asleep but listening. "It held," she said at last, as if the words ought to turn to smoke when they touched the air. "It held," he said. He thought of ice and fire, not as grand words slung back and forth like banners, but as things that had tried to kill him and had failed, as things that warmed hands and cut bread and made night gentler. He thought of roads that did not end at walls or oceans. He thought of a tree with a face cut into it and a throne made of knives, and how neither had liked him and how he had chosen them both anyway. She rested her forearms on the parapet. "What will they sing, if they sing? That we lived," Jon said dryly, "and that it was difficult, and that we tried to make it less so and sometimes succeeded." He looked at her and let the corner of his mouth tilt. "And that a king and a queen learned to be less proud than their titles." She laughed. Then, a clear light sound that startled a bat into the night. proud enough still, she asked. Enough, he agreed. They stood until the air cooled and the stars shifted and the city moved in its sleep. Tomorrow would be work again. There would be grain to get past thieves who learned their trade before they learned their letters. There would be treaties to negotiate and break and make again. There would be roads to fill and mend. There would be mistakes. There would be enemies. By then they had learned that enemies never vanish entirely but change faces. There would be grief. There would be small joys, and some of those small joys would be worth all the grief in the world for the space of a heartbeat. There would be seasons, and they would come again. When they parted that night, they did not speak of equal crowns or of old betrayals. They did not speak of bloodlines. They did not speak of prophesies. They spoke of a road that needed leveling on the stretch past Moat Cailin, and of a bridge near the Blackwater Rush whose foundation had been laid wrong years ago and would need to be redone if it were to last. They spoke of a boy who had come up to the Red Keep to bring eggs and had stared at the tapestries and had forgotten the eggs and had been forgiven. They spoke of a woman who had set up a stall in the Dragon Gate and learned to make a sweet bread that children loved and would carry to school when schools were places, not rumors. Back in the north, a storm gathered one day and then broke open again, and the lightning did not strike anyone who had not asked for it. A year later, a harvest failed in the west and men sent what they could in the east to mend it. In the south, a baker taught a blacksmith's daughter how to make a crust that held together. And in the north a boy finally kept his footing and stopped tripping on his own feet and became the Squire Davos had meant him to be. The dragons grew again. Regal's shoulder mended with a scar you could see only if the light came in from the left and you were looking for it. Viserion learned to fly with a roll that paired his wing beats into something like dancing. Drogon was Drogon and took a sheep now and then when no one was looking and then pretended he had not. Children learned the names and learned not to throw rocks, which is all you can ask of a child and a dragon both. It was not perfect. It did not need to be. It was enough that winter had done its worst and men had done theirs and still the world had chosen to go on. Enough that two sovereigns had signed a page and then signed it again with drudgery and patience and with the willingness to be wrong and be corrected. Enough that someone waking in the night to put wood on the fire could look through the window at the road and see it there, waiting to be walked when morning came. In the Godswood, the leaves of the weirwood had gone from old blood to new green. Jon sat and listened to them move. He thought of a winter that had tried to last forever and of a summer that would not. He thought of a crown that sat on his head like a weight and like a hand. He thought of the covenant and how it was a promise to be kept daily and not a thing that kept itself. He thought of the girl who had buried her dagger in a man made of cold, of the boy who had seen it before it happened, of the woman who had asked and been answered. He stood and brushed bark dust from his palms. A raven chucked in the tree above him and looked superior, as ravens do. "All right," Jon told it. "We'll keep at it." The raven did not answer, or perhaps did, in the old, untranslatable way of ravens. He turned toward the castle, which was only stone and only home. The day was not bright, but it was his, and he went to it.